You are listening to Fighting Together. We are fighting to make a positive impact in our God-hungry communities.
In today's episode of Fighting Together, I have got two pieces of good news for you. Plus, I've also got a letter that I received back in 2017 that I will read for you. Why would I do that? Find out in today's episode. My name is Tafazwa, and you are listening to Fighting Together.
These days, the internet is filled with toxic content, politics, depressing news, and statistics. If you want a bit of refuge from all that chaos, then visit www.dailypodcast.show, where we give you hope, hymns, and something different.
You are listening to Fighting Together. Sit back, relax, and enjoy our daily episodes.
A few days ago, it was my birthday. Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was good. But that's not the only good news I have. The second piece of good news I have is that our long-awaited package, the equipment that we crowdfunded for, is now in the country. The tracking code told me that, hey, the package is in the country. It's not yet on my desk. I'm now going through the process of trying to get it through customs and sending some emails around, calling some people to try and get it all worked out. But it's now in the country, not yet on my desk. The day is close now. I am very excited. I can never thank you enough for the crowdfunding campaign. And I don't need to tell you again about all the wonderful things that we have planned, all the wonderful things that I have planned with the equipment, animations, recording of songs, hymns, sermons, a whole bunch of stuff, or even the creation of new podcast shows with different hosts, doing interviews with different people with equipment that's mobile. And that's the exciting news. Birthday plus equipment now in the country. Now that we've got that news out of the way, after the break, I am going to talk to you about letters. I mean, what better subject to go into after I've just talked about a package that's now in the country? Let's talk about letters after the break.
Are you tired of consuming the same old content? Bored by the lack of variety? Stick around. Maybe this podcast will help.
The following song and other church hymns are freely available for download on www.churchofchrist.co.zw.
This podcast was brought to you by www.dailypodcast.show.
Like I said before the break, I am going to talk about letters. I'll start off by talking about letters back in the day. I think the first massive exposure I had to letters was when I was applying to go to boarding school. What we would do at this time, back in that time, was as a person, as a student who is now about to transition from what we locally call primary school into what we locally call high school. During that transition, you had to send out application letters. And it was such a such an adventure, Why? Because you had to go around to your friends. You have to know that at this time, the internet wasn't really there, kind of like how it is now, Now, when anyone wants to do anything, like if someone wants to look for a job, the first thing that comes into their mind is, I need to go onto the internet and look for a job or send an email to a company so that they can hire me, At the time that I'm talking of now, the time where the transition was happening in my life, the primary school to high school transition, that whole internet thing where the internet has all the answers wasn't, no, it wasn't like that, Anyway, yeah, so let's move on and say, at that time, you needed to write a letter, an actual physical letter that you would send with stamps and envelopes and all that stuff, And the thing that made it such an adventure, such a, I don't know, like a combat, like a battlefield of sorts, was that even getting addresses was a mission. Because you'd be like, which schools do I want to apply to? Oh, there's a school called Peterhouse. There's a school called blah, blah, blah. There's a school called ABCD. There's that school, this school, So you know all these school names, maybe because you've heard about them somewhere vaguely, or, you've never been to any of those schools. And these schools are all over the country. So you wouldn't necessarily apply to schools that are like within walking distance or driving. Well, I guess it's within driving distance, but you wouldn't want to drive all the way to those schools just to get an address. And even getting their phone numbers, everything was a bit harsh, tough. This is a time when we had phone books, but then some of the addresses in the phone books were a bit outdated and so on, So it was like a skirmish of sorts where you were just hoping that you have the right thing. And even if someone had an address, sometimes someone would, let's say there's a school that everyone wants to go to. And I don't know, like Wakanda High School, I don't know. And everyone wants to go there. So the person who has an address for this school would quickly write a letter, send it there, because you want them to accept you quickly before everyone else's letters get there. Because at this time, letters would take about a week or a week and a half or 2 weeks, depending on how far they were going. But yeah, they would take a while. And you want to have that head start so that yours gets there and they write back to you and say, you have been accepted, before anyone else finds the address, before anyone else knows the address, And the thing now was, once you've applied, people would come to you and say, oh, you applied to that school. Can I have the address? And the person would say, I left it at home, They would then start doing these delaying tactics so that they don't, give you the address quickly. And sometimes when someone gave you an address, they would be like, hey, dude, come over here. Psst. Yeah. I really like you, So here's the address for these 5 schools. Because I think in that time, you would possibly apply to almost 10 schools, 12 schools, even 15 different schools. Because what you wanted was as many yeses as you can get. So it wasn't a case of, I'm going to apply to one school and I'll fold my hands and wait for that one particular school to get back to me. No, we were applying to a lot of schools, more than 10 schools, so that at least if you get 5 letters saying yes, or 3 letters saying yes, you can now sit back and choose, You can now say, do I want eeny, meeny, miny, more, Because once you get a no, let's say, for example, you decide to risk it and you only apply to 2 schools or 3 schools. If all of them say no, you have essentially wasted 2 weeks of application time, because it took a week for your letter to get there. And maybe it even took them a week to get back to you. And then when they wrote the letter back to you, it then takes another week for that letter. So you could lose 3 weeks of valuable application time that you will never get back if you decide to apply to 1 or 2 schools. So you needed to send out as many letters as possible, as quickly as possible, and then spend the 3 weeks waiting for your feedback. Afterwards, if the school you preferred said yes, then it's a no-brainer. All is well. But if it didn't, now you're stuck with, so my 7th option and my 4th option and my 15th option all want me. The 4th option is good, but the school fees are expensive. So I might have to go with option number 7. But then option number 7 is far. Yeah, so letters were something that I got mostly exposed to through that application process. I had written other letters before that, but I think that was the most letter-intensive time of my life. Whew. Yeah, good times. After the break, I am going to talk about letters during COVID. I know, sounds like a very vague way to introduce a segment. Stick around and it will all make sense. My name is Tafadzwa and you are listening to Fighting Together.
This podcast was made possible through your donations, prayers, and continued support.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then I think you are going to love our website. Visit www.dailypodcast.show.
The splendor of a king, clothed in majesty, let all the earth rejoice, all the earth rejoice. He wraps himself in light, and darkness tries to hide. It trembles at his voice, trembles at his voice. How great is our God! Sing with me, how great is our God! And all will see how great is our God.
You are listening to Fighting Together. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to Fighting Together. I'm your host, Tafadzwa. I'm very happy to have you here. This podcast is something that you can sit back, listen to, minimize, leave it playing in the background while you do other things. That's the beauty of a podcast. I played for you a track. The voices that you heard singing, they are all members of the Church of Christ down in South Africa, Durban. The group is called Inside Out. I miss being in the congregation there in Durban and just hearing those hymns being sung and being there. But for now, I guess during the pandemic, we'll have to settle for the digital versions that we listen to all alone in our homes. Yeah, enough about that. Let's move back to our subject at hand. I think I've already hinted and talked a lot about letters, but we are not yet done. Let's dig into the Bible quickly before I talk about what I hinted, which is letters during COVID. We will talk about letters and their role in this pandemic, I guess. But before we do that, let's dig into the Bible. Wow, But before we do that, let's dig into the Bible. I should just learn to talk slowly on some of these sentences because English has got a funny way to sneak up on you and give you an unexpected tongue twister that, yeah. Anyway, right. So there are a lot of letters in the Bible. And some of those letters are massive. And I'm not just talking about letters in passing, like, what do I mean when I say letters in passing? An example of what I personally call a biblical letter in passing, which is something that's a letter, yes, and the letter is in the Bible, yes, but it's not really like a key player in the Bible, such letters that I am calling letters in passing. For example, the letter that King David gave to one of his men, saying, go with this letter to the battlefield and have the commander there read it. And when the commander read it, it essentially assigned that particular individual to the front of the war. The individual who had the letter was Uriah, and he was essentially given a letter to take to the commanding officer, which would then ensure that Uriah is put on a very hot place, a hot section of the battlefield, one that ensured his ultimate demise, his death, Yeah, so that's a letter, true, but it's only part of a story. There are other letters that play a much bigger role in the Bible. Letters like Paul's letters, the letters that Paul wrote to the Romans, the letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, to the Galatians, Ephesians, and the ones to Titus, the ones to Timothy, Yeah, so we are going to talk more about those in the next segment, but this is not that segment. Let's go back to what I promised you, letters and their role during COVID. Now, I don't know about where you are. I don't know how COVID is being handled. But here in Zimbabwe, what the government essentially is doing is that they have set aside roadblocks so that people cannot move freely, willy-nilly, People cannot just keep moving as if everything is normal. And when you get to these checkpoints, these roadblocks, you'll find police there. All the cars are stopped, and then they walk up to your car and then they say, where are you going? And you have to say something along the lines of, I'm going to work because I'm a brain surgeon or a nuclear scientist, or I work in the food industry and my workplace is very important, And after you say that, next thing is, show me a letter from your workplace, and you then have to produce a letter that's got stamps on it and signatures on it and blah, 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 and the company logo and all that stuff, Yeah, and you see, letters are just what you need to then pass through the multitudes of roadblocks. Some of them have men with guns and so on. But with a letter, that letter has the power to see you through all of that, And that's amazing. I've talked about letters before the break, saying we used letters to apply. And someone would actually be stingy with the addresses, Someone would say, I don't want to give people the address to this amazing school because I want to get accepted first. Or rather, I want my letter to have a head start first before I give everyone else the address, so that by the time their letters get there, mine would have already been accepted. Yeah, so letters can be, I don't know. They can change your life. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a letter that I promised you, which I am going to read, but we are not yet there. Let's talk about the COVID letters more. So, a few days ago, no, it's not a few days ago, it's what? Yeah, when I first got news that the package is now in the country, it's not yet in my hands. I don't have it yet, but the package that we have been waiting for, the equipment that we have been waiting for, when I first got news that it's now in the country, I then made plans to go over to the airport to do some of the stuff and talks that needed to happen. So we got to a roadblock. This was me and my father. My dad was driving, and obviously it's COVID. COVID is all around. COVID is all around. And we are there at the roadblock. The police then ask, where are you going? We produce our letters. But now here's the thing. My letter was essentially a letter that's an email, which is a letter. An email that was saying, hey, dude, we've got your package here. And that email required me to kind of go there and process some of the things. But now the police officer had a problem. He was like, this is not a letter. I said, I want to see a letter of where you work. And I was saying, I don't have a letter of where I work. I have a letter of where I'm going, which is the customs office, so that I can like answer some of their questions. And once I've answered them, they can then process the things that need to be processed, blah, 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 you know? Yeah. So emails being a letter was something that he couldn't accept, which is funny because they are a letter, they are mail. And I'm fascinated about how far we have come with letters. They now come in many forms, you know. I also produced a text message which had essentially the same information, which I personally also consider another form of a digital letter, you know. Yeah, and eventually the combination of the two digital letters, the email and the text messages, were enough for him to go, okay, you know what, pass. Then we passed. So letters, be them digital or physical, they can let you in or stop you from going somewhere because the letter says you have been rejected, your application was denied, or the letter in some cases could send you off to your death, like in the case of Uriah and David, you know. Yeah. Whew, that's a lot of power in a letter. I have a letter that I said I'll read for you, which was sent to me 3 years ago, back in 2017. But we are not yet there. After the break, let's talk a little bit more about Paul's letters. I'm going to mention something that you might find fascinating. I think you will. I don't know. Let's take the short break. My name is Tafadzwa, and you are listening to Fighting Together.
You are listening to Fighting Together. We are fighting to make a positive impact in our God-hungry communities.
We hope you have enjoyed that segment. Let's take a short break before we resume our podcast.
Are you tired of consuming the same old content? Bored by the lack of variety? Stick around. Maybe this podcast will help.
This podcast was made possible through an independent crowdfunding campaign. Visit www.dailypodcast.show if you want more episodes.
When we look at the Bible now, we essentially see it as a book, you know, and it's amazing that this book has some sections which are made up of letters, you know. Now imagine being the person who's tasked with the responsibility of delivering these letters. As I can imagine, I don't know, with my limited imagination, the deliverer of these letters, or the multiple people who delivered the multiple different letters, probably had to like have the letter on them and move about for days and sleep somewhere. And while you're sleeping, wherever you're sleeping, you have to kind of make sure that this letter to the Corinthians is safe, you know, or this letter to the Romans or whatever, you know. It's yeah, it's amazing to think of the journey, the trips, the stopovers that the person has to do while they sleep somewhere, or while they eat somewhere, or the forests or mountains they had to climb, or the roads or horses that they had to ride. I have no idea how they were doing it, but each letter had to go where it was sent, where it was destined to go. And these are letters that are like going to one day make up the Bible. Yeah, oh, that's amazing to think of. And I have with me here a Bible, which is, let me look at the back of it. It's the New King James Version, right? And I'm not necessarily saying it's the best version. I can't comment on which one is the best or whatever. But for the because I've got different Bible versions. But for the purposes of what I want to achieve right now, it has what I needed. And which is, we won't talk about all the letters that Paul wrote, but we will focus on this particular one, which is Romans, and in it then says, which part do I want to get to? Yeah, it says Romans, because this particular Bible has an introduction to each book or each letter in this case, and for the letter Romans, the epistle of Paul to the Romans, it essentially describes it as follows. Romans was written to pave the way for Paul's visit to a church he had never seen, but whose help he needed as he began to preach the gospel in the Western Mediterranean world. Romans is one of the fullest statements of Paul's faith. So it's got a whole bunch of other things it says in there. But this letter was being sent to a congregation that Paul had received help from several times, but yet he had never actually seen the people. He had never been there, and the letter was now sent to pave way, for his coming there, Yeah, and it's fascinating. And I just thought we should share that little piece of information. Part of what Fighting Together is trying to achieve. We hope that when you listen to this podcast, you have a newfound passion, a newfound excitement, a newfound love for the Word of God, And in Romans, one other thing to point at is, which chapter? Romans chapter 16, verse 22. It reads, I, Tertius. Now, remember, this is Romans, the letter that we're saying Paul wrote. And essentially, it's the Holy Spirit that wrote the Bible. It's the Holy Spirit that wrote this. But through Paul. I forgot to emphasize that earlier. Now, verse 22. I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, greet you in the Lord. And it's exciting. It's fascinating to then come across that you're in Romans, the book which we have been saying was written by Paul, and then next thing you know, there's one of the last verses is saying, I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, greet you. And like, wait. Where's this guy coming from? And the thing was, Paul would dictate the words in this particular case, not in all cases, but he was dictating it while Tertius was writing it down, a bit like a scribe. And then he was the one who had the actual hand that was writing while Paul was dictating in this particular case, not all the letters or all the books or whatever you want to call it. So I thought I should put it in there. And I mean, it's such a fascinating thing to think how far letters have come. Mail has come a long way from dictating it to someone, writing it to yourself, having it as an email. And I can't imagine how it's going to be like maybe 200 years from now. Yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this segment. I really enjoy introducing you to some concepts that you might not be aware of, or some concepts that you don't always hear but kind of end up forgetting. Either way, this is Fighting Together, and we hope to keep making more content that gets you excited about the Word of God. The last thing I shall now do is I will now read the letter that I promised you, which is a letter I received back in 2017, and I will comment on it. And here it goes. Dear Tafadzwa Tarumbwa, I would like to thank you for your participation in the Queen's birthday party on the 23rd of June at my residence. I wanted to personally express my thanks for your very kind contribution of time and effort to this successful event. Now, that's not the whole letter. It keeps going on. And this was a letter that I received from the then ambassador, the British ambassador in Zimbabwe. And I mean, it's so fascinating. It was, I love this letter. I have a lot of letters I love. One of the letters I also love is a letter I received, was it 2 weeks ago, from Oklahoma. And I love letters, especially when they come with a personal touch, And for this particular letter, it was delivered by, it didn't come by regular mail. There was a driver who drove and came with one of those embassy cars, I don't know if you've ever been exposed to embassy lifestyles where they have very specific cars that have different number plates from the regular cars. And to have one of those cars drive up to where I was, and then the driver coming out and he's all dressed up in his suit, and then he's like, "Are you Tafadzo Tarumbwa?" You know, and he's like, "Say, I have a letter for you." And I'm like, "Ooh, I must say." Letters can have such an impact, you know. Letters can, I have no words for them. And the ones in the Bible have a effect that's had unmeasurable impact to the human race. They have been translated into multiple languages. And that's just fascinating to think that at one point in time, Romans was just a letter that was in someone's, I don't know, jacket. I don't know, they didn't wear jackets. But either way, a letter that was just being carried by someone, somewhere. And did he know that that letter was going to be translated into Shona? I mean, let me read Romans 16:22 in Shona and just have you go through that. In fact, let me not start there. I will kind of start from the top a bit, which is verse 21. The reason why I'm starting from verse 21 is because this particular segment of the letter is like the conclusion of the letter, where the greetings are now being done. You know, the whole, oh, greet my mother, greet that person, greet the guy next door, and blah, 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 end of letter. You know, where you greet random people in the letter. So that's the segment. Timoteo anobata nemi, anokukwazisai sezvinoita Rusiasi na Jasoni na Sosipata, hama dzangu. Ini Teritiasia ndanyora tsamba iyi ndinokukwazisai munashe. Gayosi uyo akakugamuchirai ini nekereke yose iri kuno anokukwazisai. Now they're just saying, "Oh, I greet this person, greets you, that person," and I guess that's why the person who was writing I will just use the word scribe, but I know there's another word for it. The scribe that was writing this letter thought, okay, now that we're on the conclusion, let me also throw my own greeting in there to say, "I, Tertius, also greet you." Yeah, and this guy greets you, that guy, and so on and so on. And do you remember the joy of letters? I don't know if you do. If you have anything you want to say, leave it in the comments below. I think I've covered quite a lot, and I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Fighting Together.